Have you ever thought about how two countries can share a border, so much culture, even a language, and yet end up living in completely different worlds? Well, today that's exactly what we're looking at. This is the story of Oman and Yemen, two neighbors whose fates couldn't be more different. So that's the big mystery we're going to try and solve. How on earth does this happen? How did two nations that look so similar on a map get sent down two completely opposite paths? To really get to the bottom of it, we've got to start with the hard data. And wow, the numbers really just speak for themselves. I mean, look at that GDP per capita. Oman is more than 20 times wealthier than Yemen. Life expectancy? People in Oman live a full decade longer. And the Human Development Index, that's a measure of things like health and education, it puts Oman in the very high bracket while Yemen is stuck in the low tier. And remember, these aren't just numbers on a screen. They represent millions of real lives. Okay, so to begin to understand how a gap like that opens up, our first and maybe biggest clue is right at the top. It seems like the single most important factor boils down to leadership, the vision or lack thereof of the people in charge over the last half-century. This timeline really just lays it all out. You can see Yemen's modern history is just this tragic, repeating cycle of conflict. Civil wars, a short-lived unification that leads to another civil war, and then, of course, the horrible conflict that's still going on today. Now look at Oman. It has this one single turning point, 1970. That's the year Sultan Qaboos came to power, and he basically set the country on a 50-year path of peace, stability, and development. And you have to understand where Oman was starting from. I mean, in 1970, it was one of the most isolated and undeveloped places on the planet. We're talking 3 schools in the entire country. Sultan Qaboos had the power of an absolute monarch, but here's the critical part. He aimed that power outwards, to build a nation, not inwards, to fill his own pockets. This right here gets to the heart of 2 totally different ways of ruling. In Yemen, President Saleh was a master of divide and conquer. He stayed in power for decades by playing different tribes and factions off against each other. It kept him on top, sure, but it also completely hollowed out the state, creating what experts call a kleptocracy, basically rule by thieves. Sultan Qaboos in Oman? He did the exact opposite. His whole project was about building a single Omani national identity that was stronger than any tribal loyalty. He built a real state that people could trust. So, we know leadership set them on different courses, but what was the fuel for the journey? Well, that brings us to our second big factor, oil. You see, finding oil can be like winning the lottery for a country. But, as we're about to see, if you're not careful, that blessing can quickly turn into a curse. This is a fascinating idea in economics called the resource curse. Now, the theory sounds completely backward, right? It says that countries that get lucky and find a ton of oil or other natural resources often end up worse off than countries that don't. How can that be? Well, that easy money can breed corruption, it can kill off other parts of the economy, and it lets the government ignore its own people because it doesn't need their tax money anymore. And when you look at Yemen and Oman, the first thing you notice is just simple math. Oman had a lot of oil wealth to go around for a pretty small population, only about 5.5 million people. Yemen, on the other hand, had less oil and a massive population, almost 6 times bigger. So for Oman, that oil money could be truly transformative for every single person. For Yemen, it was more like a drop in a very, very big bucket. But here's the most important part. It's not just about how much oil you have, it's about what you do with it. Yemen showed all the classic symptoms of the resource curse. The oil money just fueled corruption and was spent wildly, creating huge booms and busts. But Oman, with its long-term vision, did the opposite. It methodically plowed that oil money into building roads, schools, and hospitals. And even more importantly, it planned for a day when the oil would run out, building up new industries like tourism and shipping. Oman managed to turn its resource wealth into a genuine blessing. Okay, so we've got leadership, and we've got resources. That brings us to our final piece of the puzzle. And it's probably the most fundamental one. The slow, hard, unglamorous work of building a state that actually functions, building institutions people can trust. In Yemen, the state didn't just get weak. In a lot of places, it just dissolved. It was replaced by what's called a war economy. Think about that. It's a system where conflict is actually good for business. Smuggling, corruption, exploiting resources, that becomes the economy. Your loyalty is to your tribe or your militia, not the country. And in that kind of environment, a vicious cycle kicks in, where the instability just feeds itself, and basic things we take for granted, like schools and hospitals, they just fall apart. Meanwhile, during those exact same decades, Oman was patiently putting the building blocks of a modern state into place. It created a professional civil service, courts that worked, and a reputation for being stable. Its famous foreign policy of being neutral, kind of like the Switzerland of the Middle East, kept it safe from all the regional wars that tore its neighbors apart. And that basic commitment to the rule of law made Oman a place where foreign companies felt safe to invest, which helped grow the economy even more. This quote here, from back in 2010, just before everything fell apart, really sums it all up. The system in Yemen wasn't just broken by accident, it was designed to be weak. President Saleh built this strange, feudal system, not to deliver services to the people, but to keep himself in power by rewarding his friends and punishing his enemies. So, now that we've looked at these two completely different stories, what can we take away from it all? Well, when you lay it all out, it seems like you can actually see a clear recipe for how a nation succeeds or how it fails. Yeah, it really does seem to boil down to a three-step process. First, you need stable leadership that's thinking about the next 50 years, not just the next election. Second, whatever wealth you have, you've got to use it strategically to invest in your own people and your future. And third, all of that has to be built on a solid foundation of institutions, a government and a legal system that people actually trust. Oman checked all three boxes. Yemen, tragically, checked none. And so that leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. The tale of these two neighbors really forces us to ask a huge question. What's more important for a country's success? The riches you have under the ground, or the vision of the people in charge? The stories of Yemen and Oman, well, they seem to give us a pretty clear and powerful answer.